It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we continue our WNYC Centennial Series, 100 Years of 100 Things. It's Thing 22 today, and it's kind of a two-for-one. 100 years of Robert Moses, the iconic urban planner who designed so much of New York's infrastructure, structure for better and for worse, and 50 years of The Power Broker, the iconic book about Robert Moses, written by Robert Caro. Robert Moses grew up in New Haven and Manhattan. 110 years ago, in 1914, he earned a doctorate in political science from Columbia. He started out in public life as an idealist and a reformer. 100 years ago, in 1924, Governor Al Smith appointed Moses to several positions overseeing parks, including president of the Long Island State Park Commission. And in that year, 1924, 100 years ago, Robert Moses conceived of building Jones Beach. He talked about it in a 1959 interview. I think this is from NBC News, in a series titled Manufacturing Intellect.
Now, you take a thing like projects like Jones Beach, for example. Well, we've been at Jones Beach since 1924. That's a long time. The original plan is no different from the present plan. We've carried out about maybe 70% of it, 75% of it, in the course of 35 years. That's how long it's taken. And it just happens to be our good fortune or luck or whatever you may call it, that the people who originally conceived the idea are still around. They're extant and maybe a little groggy, but they're still here.
A little groggy, but they're still here. And in a way, that little clip of Robert Moses sets the scene for the larger story. He had big ideas for redesigning New York, Jones Beach, and lots of other stuff. And he figured out how to stay in power, still here, for a really long time. Here's another clip from that 1959 interview in which he talks about urban planning generally, and you can hear his extreme confidence in himself, or maybe this sounds like arrogance.
My experience has been that many of the people, by no means all, who call themselves planners, are people who make pretty pictures. They draw things. They present a plausible and often dramatic, melodramatic program, but they're not people that get anything done. And many of them are entirely satisfied when they've finished the plan, when they've announced the plan. That's the end of it. Because they don't have the stick-to-itiveness, they don't have the guts, they don't have the ability to combat, to fight in the forum to get things accomplished.
Robert Moses in 1959. We've got a few more very revealing clips from that video to play, and this one of Robert Caro, the journalist who wrote the book about Robert Moses, the book called The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. The Power Broker is now celebrating its 50th anniversary and still is an incredibly prominent and influential work of biography and New York political analysis. Caro summed up Moses' legacy the way he sees it this way to New York One's Errol Louis.
Certainly Robert Moses was great at getting big things built, right? He built with the single exception of the FDR Drive, every parkway and expressway that you drive on, he built. All the bridges since 1931, all the parks, etc. But, you know, what I wrote in The Power Broker, the epigraph, the sentence at the beginning of the book, Errol, is a quote from Sophocles. It says, "One must wait until the evening to see how splendid the day has been." When Robert Moses left office after 44 years in absolute power, the city was really in chaos.
Robert Caro speaking with Errol Louis, political anchor for Spectrum News New York 1, who joins us now as our guest for this edition of 100 Years of 100 Things. Errol has a new episode of his podcast called You Decide out today about the Power Broker at 50, and that includes that clip. Errol, always good to have you on, usually to talk about current events. Today to talk about 100 years of current events that still shape New York City and the whole area today. Welcome back to WNYC.
Always great to be with you, Brian. And this is, of course, is both about the past, but also very much about the present.
Absolutely. And listeners, we invite your oral histories or any other comments, questions, or stories. And about the present, listeners, do you see the legacy of Robert Moses, for better or worse, in your neighborhood today or anywhere in your New York life? 212-433 WNYC. Do you see the legacy of Robert Moses, for better or worse, in your neighborhood today or anywhere in your New York life? 212-433 WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. Or we'll give you another option of a way to chime in here. If you read The Power Broker, what stays with you about that book, or how did it influence your worldview? If you read The Power Broker at any time in its 50 years of existence, what stays with you about that book, or how did it influence you in any way? Or with any other comments, questions, or a story, call or text 212-433-WNYC. Errol, the clip we played from your podcast of Robert Caro begins to set the scene. Robert Moses did so much to design the New York we know today, but his legacy, for better or worse, who he helped and who he hurt, is very mixed. So can you start with the first half of that? How much Robert Moses infrastructure, parks, highways, anything else we use today, mostly without thinking of him, is from him?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, listen, anybody, especially newcomers to New York, you want to tell them on this subject, any road that you're on that says expressway, that's, the Van Wyck Expressway, the Cross Bronx Expressway, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, those are all Robert Moses projects. The Triborough Bridge, which was the first big project and probably the most meaningful in a way, because, we take it for granted that you could just drive from Queens into the Bronx or into Manhattan, but you used to have to take a boat. And that was one of his crowning achievements. And in fact, that's where he had his headquarters on any given day. You could probably find him tucked underneath the Triborough Bridge. And that doesn't even begin to touch on it. Right. I mean, there's Lincoln Center, and there's the Fordham campus right behind Lincoln Center, and there's the United Nations. I mean, there's a lot of projects, all of which are connected.
The bio of Moses on the Encyclopedia Britannica website says, among the works completed under his supervision were a network of 35 highways, 12 bridges, numerous parks, and we'll get to the parks, which many people consider the best part of his legacy, I think. Lincoln Center, Shea Stadium, many housing projects, 2 hydroelectric dams, and the 1964 World's Fair, as well as it also cites the UN complex on Manhattan's East Side. So just to give listeners who are unfamiliar an idea of the scope of his vision and influence. And in the Robert Caro clip that we played from your podcast, he cites 44 years as the length of time Moses stayed in power without being elected to anything. Is the heart of Caro's problems with Robert Moses, since it is a largely critical book, the accumulation of power itself? The book is called The Power Broker, not the Bad Urban Planner or the Destroyer of Neighborhoods or anything like that? Or was it more that Moses left a legacy of damage and destruction as well as building and creation?
It's interesting because there's a somewhat complicated moral voice to this book. And the subtitle is Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. So he's already making a judgment right up front that this has not been for the better, by and large, both due to bad urban planning concepts like always building new roads. And when one road became congested, you'd build another road to alleviate the congestion. And we now know that roads are basically magnets. They are traffic attractors. So even the ones that are supposed to alleviate traffic end up getting clogged in fairly short order. So Robert Caro, as an investigative reporter, finds all of that abhorrent, just as a New Yorker. He's a kid from the Bronx, and he sees all of these things happening, and he doesn't like what's happening to the city. But he also is giving us a warning, I think, about what happens when too much power accumulates in the hands of one person. And the idea that we had an unelected person who could not easily be removed because he wrote little clauses into a lot of the documents, and the architecture of his power was just as complex as any bridge or road that he was responsible for. And you couldn't easily undo it. And we have, I guess, taken care of that to a certain extent. I mean, the whole fact that we have all of these community boards and the uniform land use review procedures, and the fact that some now complain that we've gone too far in the other direction, that in wanting to stop any one person from becoming another Robert Moses, we've made it very hard for anybody to easily get anything built that's of any size or scope or large impact. And there's a certain truth to that, for sure.
I think Thomas in Red Hook has an example from his neighborhood of one of the things that occurs in a number of places in the city that people really, really resent about what Robert Moses did. Thomas, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. What you got?
So, yes, I live in Red Hook, and it's very apparent the Gowanus Expressway splits through Red Hook. It's almost impossible to get across Hamilton Avenue except for a couple of overpasses. But from what I know of this book, and I struggle with whether Robert Moses was a genius or an evil genius, because certainly a lot of what he did was destructive and also, quite beautiful, especially Jones Beach. But it seems from his work that he was fairly racist, and especially in cutting off poorer neighborhoods like Red Hook, which was once the drug capital of the world, as opposed to Cobble Hill or Carroll Gardens, which are much more wealthy because of that expressway. Second Avenue under that expressway was completely destroyed from being a sort of a neighborhood extension of whatever was to the east, the neighborhoods to the east, Park Slope. And now it's just sort of a commercial wasteland.
Thomas, thank you very much for that story. And we're going to play a clip of Robert Moses, another one from that 1959 interview that made my head explode, Errol, when I heard it, when he addressed that kind of complaint. But I want to throw one other example on there, just like Thomas's. Can you talk about the Cross Bronx Expressway in particular? It comes up in your podcast as maybe the most prominent example of the ill effects of the way Robert Moses built infrastructure.
Oh, yeah, an absolute disaster. And by the way, my son went to middle and high school in Red Hook. So I actually had to cross Hamilton Avenue in that canal, and it was like a Mission Impossible adventure every single morning for like 5 or 6 years. I mean, he's absolutely right about that. The Cross Bronx was another one of these examples, and it was almost worse in some ways. The elevated Gowanus is like a big dinosaur looming over a neighborhood, spewing a lot of particulate pollution and sort of dooming a lot of businesses. The Cross Bronx was even worse in a way because it carved through neighborhoods, and Robert Moses was determined to do it his way. And in The Power Broker, they describe how neighborhood activists and residents pleaded with him to make just a small adjustment to it so as not to displace tens of thousands of families. And at that point, Robert Moses was at the peak of his power, didn't want to hear it, wouldn't do it, slashed through the neighborhood and displaced thousands upon thousands of families.
Yes.
And to this day, and it's very sad, there are still people, the remnants of that destruction from decades ago, who get together once in a while for a kind of a reunion to try to celebrate and in some ways memorialize what had been thriving communities. And then, of course, as a traffic proposition, I personally organize my driving in New York around avoiding the Cross Bronx at all costs. I mean, I just don't get on that road. I mean, it's a 24-hour traffic jam. Just horrible.
My father grew up in a building that was then cleared away. That is now part of the Cross Bronx Expressway. And how about Lincoln Center in that respect? Before we play this clip, wonderful Lincoln Center, but it came with a displacement of many lower-income New Yorkers who had housing in that neighborhood, which was known at the time as San Juan Hill, right?
That's right, San Juan Hill, and it was Black and Puerto Rican and Irish. It was an integrated neighborhood in a lot of ways. It was a working-class neighborhood. There's a wonderful documentary, I believe it was actually about the Metropolitan Opera, that sort of talked about what was there and even showed some of it. And they had one of these land use fights. And again, modern New Yorkers may not be used to this idea, but there would be meetings and people would come out and they would shout and they would ask for different kind of considerations or a new plan or less disruption and so forth. But back then, Robert Moses would stand there and he would listen and he would, kind of look down his nose at them and say, nope, we're going forward. And nothing would change. There were no compromises. There was little discussion. And that was one of those casualties. And again, we look at it now. Modern planning suggests that even for a cultural arts center, sort of disrupting the grid and making it hard to get there. Anybody who's ever had to try to walk across those big plazas to get to where you're going, recognize that there's a different and a better way to do things.
So here's that 1959 relevant clip of Robert Moses from that NBC interview in a series called Manufacturing Intellect. And I could hardly believe I found this. Moses speaking directly about disrupting people and communities for what he saw as the greater good. He references what he calls Lincoln Square, I think, meaning Lincoln Center. And again, this begins with Moses, the power broker himself, referring openly to the fact that he has been in power for so long.
Those of us who have been around for quite a while, and don't forget, we have survived somehow or other in public office, don't get excited about criticism. We try to be reasonable about it. We try to understand that if you have to move a lot of people out of the way of a big housing project or slum clearance project like, say, Lincoln Square, whatever the objective may be, or out of the way of an approach to a bridge, that a lot of them are not going to like it. Many of them are misinformed. Many of them, in the end, come around to feel that you've done them a great service. And but in the process, if there is somebody to excite them, to steam them up, somebody that is a ringleader, you get a terrific amount of criticism. And newspapers join in it, churches join in it, and there it is. And that frightens the elected offices. They're scared. And even those that have commissioned you to do the job run out on you, or they weaken.
Errol, that's a remarkable clip, I think, both for what it says about Robert Moses' view of disrupting communities and for his pretty casual dismissal of community opposition, dismisses churches, to his plans over time when opposition did arise. Did you ever hear that one before?
I had not heard that particular clip, but it certainly tracks with what we know about this man and his legacy. I mean, this is, if you think about it and you listen to the clip carefully, he's disdaining, homeowner associations, tenant groups, churches, and ultimately democracy itself in the form of elected officials. And he's like, oh, yeah, and of course, these people get steamed up because there's the agitators, and then they go to the politicians, and then they just want to win elections and so forth. And it's like, yeah, that's pretty much the way it's supposed to work, Mr. Moses. The alternative being, everybody just gives over their lives, yes, their homes, and their future to Robert Moses, who, by the way, built all of these bridges and roads and never got a driver's license, never drove a car in his life.
Really? How about that? Let's see. We're getting so many interesting calls, and a number of them, I should say, and you have this in your podcast too, represented by the esteemed historian of New York City, Kenneth T. Jackson, defending Moses from some of this criticism. And I think we're going to get some of that from Patrick in Oak Beach. Is it, Patrick? You're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes, it is Oak Beach, and every day I drive on Ocean Parkway, enjoying everything that Moses built here from Jones Island, frankly, all the way out to Montauk. By the way, I used to be the Suffolk County executive, but I have an interesting story. When I first started in politics, I started working for a guy named Tom Downey, who was a Watergate baby, got elected in '74. And he represented the South Shore, and there was a little cocktail party in Babylon, because that's where Moses lived, had a house there, as well as in New York City, to meet Downey, and Downey wanted to meet him. So Tom Downey was there, and he leaned over, and Moses introduced himself. By the way, Moses was quite formidable, big, strong, big chest. I remember it like it was yesterday. And here I am, this little aide, helping him introduce to Mr. Moses. And Miss Downey says to Moses, Downey's 25-year-old Congressman, Mr. Moses, I think you'll be interested to know that I've got the first major appropriation, federal appropriation for the Fire Island National Seashore. And Moses paused and looked at him. He looked at him and said, excuse me? How big was that appropriation? He said, $11 million. And Moses squinted and again leaned into the congressman a little bit more and said, for those people, those snobs from Manhattan, I had a plan for Fire Island to do what I did at Jones Beach, which was to open it from one end to the other and enable the people to enjoy it, and not just a handful of people who happen to have summer homes there.
But wait a minute. Patrick, let me read to you, because this is the next piece of the conversation we're going to have.
Sure.
About race and class and whether Robert Moses designed the Southern State Parkway to exclude buses because it wouldn't bring lower income people, also read black and brown people, to Jones Beach. I'm on the Jones Beach website, the official website of Jones Beach. Yeah. And it says this in its history section. It says, Robert Moses, the famous 20th century park and city planner, is a primary creator of Jones Beach. It was his vision and perseverance that made Jones Beach a reality. Jones Beach was designed for a very specific patron, the car-owning, city-dwelling middle class. So that's what the Jones Beach website ascribes to Robert Moses' motivation. So you, as a former Suffolk County executive and fan of Moses, how does that strike you?
Well, I think he was very much a person of his times. If you recall, we had a thing called World War II that came, and you had this big, and all of a sudden, everything from New York, from the boroughs and everything moved to Long Island. It was all the returning veterans. But yes, that was built before. Of course, it was done at a time when, frankly, there was discrimination, sadly. But on the other hand, if you go to Jones Beach or Robert Moses or any of the other state parks, they're as diverse as the people who live in the communities today. So what I see is that he made these areas accessible, and they could have very, very easily ended up looking like Long Beach, the Rockaways, the Jersey Shore, all these other places that, frankly, sadly, have been destroyed by overdevelopment and lack of concern. But living here,
I got you. I want to leave it there for time and get some other people on, but I really appreciate your call. Thank you very much. So we're going to take a break and follow up on that little piece of the conversation and talk a little bit more about one of the things that maybe is one of the most enduring things from the book about Moses, the Power Broker, celebrating its 50th anniversary, the allegation that Moses purposely built the bridges low on the southern state to keep those buses and those poorer people and people of color out, and some pushback to that's in Errol's podcast. So stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we are in our WNYC Centennial Series, 100 Years of 100 Things. Thing 22 today, kind of a twofer, 100 years of Robert Moses, the iconic urban planner, and 50 years of The Power Broker, the iconic book about Robert Moses, written by Robert Caro, C-A-R-O, if you don't know, with my guest, Errol Louis, from Spectrum News NY1, political anchor there, who I call the best reason to still have cable, with his Inside City Hall show Monday through Thursday and his national politics show Friday nights there, and his podcast, You Decide, the current episode of which is about 50 years of The Power Broker. And in a minute, we're going to go to a caller from Milwaukee, Errol, who's reading The Power Broker right now. So that's going to be interesting. But we have to talk explicitly about race and class, as we started to do before the break. How does Caro primarily address it in terms of Robert Moses' feelings and policies?
Look, he talks about how what ended up enshrined in New York in the way of parks and barriers to parks and uh, the roadways, the pathways, the opening up of Long Island in particular was shot through with racism. He makes a compelling case for it. He, as a reporter, some of those 522 interviews were with people who worked for Robert Moses, and they say, yeah, this was not a guy who was particularly open-minded about this, and in fact, uh, not only didn't mind racial segregation, but in fact, sort of furthered it. And like so much of what he did, he built it in stone in ways that decades later we're still trying to undo. And the most famous example, of course, is that the good Robert Moses, if you want to put it that way, who opened up Long Island by building the northern and southern state parkways, as well as the Long Island Expressway, which was a very complicated process that involved getting a lot of permission from private landowners, using a lot of the landfill to actually build Jones Beach, which is one of the great beaches on the East Coast. All of that is wonderful, but according to the book, according to Caro, he talked with people who said, well, they specifically made those low bridges, those 8 foot, 10 foot, 11 foot clearances on those stone bridges over the northern and southern parkways to prevent regular city buses from bringing black and brown kids or families out to the beaches that he was providing access to. It's been a point of controversy. There are people who say that that's not necessarily true, who point out that actually, if you're diligent enough about it, you can find your way out to the beach. Those aren't the only roads to get out there, for example. There are questions about whether or not Robert Moses really intended that. But I think it's a great conversation to have and to pick through all of the evidence for and against the proposition that this master planner planned to keep the races separate.
I guess you could take Northern Boulevard forever with all its stoplights and then go south on the Meadowbrook. But on your podcast, you got some pushback on that accusation from the historian Kenneth T. Jackson, who teaches at Columbia and is editor of the Encyclopedia of New York City. Here's that clip where he gives you an alternative explanation for the low bridges, citing the parkway's designer.
Truth is, Arnold Vollmer, who was the designer, said, if he was trying to design them so buses can go, he didn't tell me, and I designed them. He said, what Jane Jacobs didn't realize and Robert Caro didn't realize is if you raise the height of the bridges, those beautiful arch bridges, 3 feet, you just double their price. It's not like I'm just choosing to do this. It's aesthetically better and economically better.
So, Errol, I don't know if you have your own take, but keep Jones Beach white and free of poor people versus keep the parkway aesthetically pleasing and affordable to build. I don't know if it'll ever be settled, or maybe it is settled, but Kenneth T. Jackson is a credible source, probably without an axe to grind, but maybe so is Robert Caro.
Well, look, I think it's a distinction without a difference, to tell you the truth. I mean, where it's, kind of like, well, we were just trying to save a buck. Well, yeah, okay, fine. Every, owner of a slave ship in the 18th century probably said the same thing, right? I mean, that doesn't make it any better, and it frankly doesn't make it that much different. The point that I think Caro is getting at, that runs across a lot of the different projects that he covers in the book, is that either this is for the public, meaning the whole public, the whole people, or it's not. And once you start making these distinctions and saying, well, Fire Island is for these people and Jones Beach is for those people, and, the Orchard Beach up in the Bronx, another right. Robert Moses project, that's for those, that's for another group of people.
You're being a race and class puppet master at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the central point being, it's just at the whims of Robert Moses. He might have been progressive and tolerant, or he might not have been. The point was you couldn't change him, and that is to me the most important point of the book.
Sam in Milwaukee, currently reading The Power Broker. Sam, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello, man. Brian and Errol talking about Moses. This is true New York history being made right now. I am reading The Power Broker. I am halfway through. For those who want to read The Power Broker but are daunted by the 1,000-page sort of limit, I would say listen to the audiobook. It makes a huge difference. I'm actually doing the audiobook right now, and it's 66 hours long, but I'm 37 hours through at the moment. But I actually have a story that I wanted to share, but just to like comment on the racism element of Robert Moses, he is like most certainly a racist. It's actually documented back in his days at Oxford when he was in graduate school, and he nearly caused a race riot during a mock debate, where he discussed how, obviously, again, people will say that he's a product of his time, but he actually was talking about how black people don't have the right to autonomy or voting, and they can't make decisions on their own. And of course, maybe in America, come the turn of the century, this might not have been such a radical thing to say out loud in public, but in England, it actually he was almost stormed off the stage. They had to run him off in fear that it would cause a panic. He also, in Harlem, too, only designed one park. He refused to create open space for families with children. Obviously, he didn't care if they were playing in the alleyways or in the gutters with broomsticks for stickball. He only created one park, and in the park that he did create, he was a very, very obsessive. He's obsessed with detail, right? The book goes so far into how crazy he was with his vision for Jones Beach and all the details for the bathhouse and the stone masonry and the tiles. He knew everything to such a fine point that he could have been, obviously, instead of a legislator, like a designer, right? But he also made sure that, like, he knew what he was doing. So in Harlem, in the one park that he designed, he made sure that the guardrails in front of the bathrooms were iron wrought with images of monkeys. He was a racist. There's just no way around it. And even friends and confidants will say, well, you know how Robert feels about, So you could defend him. I don't really see a point doing it because also he didn't care about people. He didn't like people. He actually saw them as impediments, and he would use them and dispose of them until they served him, and that's it. He didn't care. So the need to defend him is kind of it's a moot point, honestly. Anywho, I love this book. It's the best book I've ever read, honestly, or listened to. Also, even though he's such a monster, Caro describes his relationship with Alfred Smith so beautifully, the governor of New York, that it like made me cry. Such loyalty and friendship between these two. It's kind of like astonishing the way that Caro can be so nuanced in his portrayal of Moses. This is all to say that I started reading this back in the summer, and I was with my parents on the Upper West Side. They live in a rent-stabilized apartment on the Upper West Side. My father is from Washington Heights, German-Jewish immigrant family. My mother is from the Rockaways, Beach 140th, and actually that house stayed with us all the way up until Hurricane Sandy when it was destroyed. And, we would spend all of our summers and weekends traveling from the Upper West Side down the West Side Highway, which Caro talks a lot about, and we would get on the Van Wyck. This is how we would get there. West Side Highway onto the Van Wyck, right? And my parents, despite being the most native New Yorkers imaginable, didn't really know the extent of Robert Moses. I think maybe a lot of New Yorkers might relate to this. Oh, Robert Moses. Yeah, I know Robert Moses. But then when you hear everything he built, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to know just how, grand his vision was for the city. And then finally, I'm reading the introduction to them, and they're sitting there, and we get to all the parkways and parks that he built, and suddenly the Van Wyck shows up. And my mother, who's sitting on the couch and is kind of dozing off a little bit, her eyes perk up, and she goes, "He built the Van Wyck? He should be in jail." He's literally so many hours and days of our lives were lost, stuck in traffic
on the Van Wyck. Sam, thank you for a wonderful call. I really appreciate you chiming in the ways that you did, and being on hour 37, did you say, of the audio book. Errol, is there an alternative vision of how highways could have been built in New York? I mean, one way to look at that time is that all of the United States was building highways as the car was becoming ubiquitous, right? So if it wasn't the Cross Bronx Expressway, let's say, the way it is, it would have had to be some other way for I-95, which goes up the whole East Coast, to include New York City and, come over the George Washington Bridge or something and then somehow head up to Boston. So, other people who are stuck on the Van Wyck as they're going to Kennedy Airport or wherever they're going, the alternative would be the local streets with the lights. So I don't know.
Yeah, look, we are certainly part of what was at least a half century of what we now know were either mistakes, however well-intentioned,
right,
or problems that now have to be solved. Let's put it that way. If you think about some of the Robert Moses projects that never got built, though, you can see that we weren't just kind of going with the flow. We were in the vanguard of some of the worst ideas that were out there. So Robert Moses wanted to build a bridge from, across the Long Island Sound, from Rye, a suspension bridge, mind you, from Rye to Oyster Bay. We would have ended up looking like some of those horrible bridges you see across, like the Oakland Bay Bridge or the one down in New Orleans, where it's just a giant rusting shadow over a city.
Let me jump in and play one more clip, okay? Do you want to finish that point real quick?
Yeah. Well, the other, of course, is the Brooklyn Battery Bridge. He lost that particular fight, and so we have the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. But that was going to be another suspension bridge, looking like the Manhattan Bridge, leaping from Battery Park over into the Red Hook area. Well, what a disaster that would have been.
Your podcast notes that Moses was still alive when Caro's book came out 50 years ago, and he issued a 23-page point-by-point rebuttal to some of it. Here's one more clip of Moses from that 1959 interview, 15 years before The Power Broker, but still very revealing about Moses' relationship to criticism of his work when he develops a policy or a plan.
In the process, there's a tremendous amount of criticism. Some of it is justified, some of it unjustified. Some of it's constructive, and much of it is uninformed, and a good deal of it, unfortunately, is strictly malicious. Some of it comes from people who have nothing to do but criticize. They don't have any other talent.
Talk about arrogant.
Yeah, well, look, you and I have heard this probably our whole careers, right? I mean, that's of course one of the arguments that people in power like to make. Well,
About
at least I'm doing
journalists.
something.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
I think somebody named Adams was making that assertion just the other day. Last thing. We just have 20 seconds for an answer. But Lizzie Gottlieb, the editor's daughter, who's in your podcast, says such a book could probably never be written again. Is that because of the economics of publishing have changed so much that nothing that deeply researched could be funded? 20 seconds.
Well, that's exactly right. And not only that, but, just like you can't build a bridge just because you want to, no person has the kind of centralized power that would enable you to sort of push through a risky project like this book. And I think that's the reason.
And that's 100 years of 100 things for today. Thing 22, 100 years of Robert Moses and 50 years of the book about him, The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York by Robert Caro, with our guest, Errol Louis, political anchor on New York One, Mondays through Fridays, local and including his Friday national show, and his podcast, You Decide. Their episode about The Power Broker at 50 is out today. Errol, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Brian.
Our next 100 Years of 100 Things segment will be next Monday on 100 Years of Culture Wars over Education.